All right. Hey, class, how's it going? So here we are, Unit 11, Chapter 12 in our book. And what we're going to do today is we're going to spend some time talking about the role of the cathedral and the birth of the university. So, as you can see up here, this is a real picture of the Lincoln Cathedral in Lincoln, England. And I just want to stress the size and the scope of imagination and of real estate and of money that the building of these cathedrals would take up in the mind of the medieval people and the medieval nobility. So, if we go back to one of our earlier conversations about if you look at the largest, most expensive, most intricate architectural and engineering feats of a particular people and civilization and time period, it will always tell you about their values. And I don't think anything typifies this better for the medieval period than the building of the cathedrals. For about a 500 to 1,000 years, the cathedrals were the most impressive architectural works completed, far more impressive in their detail and intricacies than even the castles of that era were, at least the late medieval or the second half of the medieval period. So, just to give you guys an idea, the cathedral period is going to run from about 1,000 to, let's say, 1,300. Remember, the fall of Rome hits at 500. A lot of people refer to this as really the Dark Ages from 500 to 1,000. A lot of people will say all the way to the Renaissance in the 1,300. But during this time period, in conjunction with the development of the cathedral, we're also going to see spinning out of cathedral culture or the cathedral phenomena, we're going to see the birth of the university system. Not the first time that we've had organized modern education, but the first kind of creation of what we would recognize as a modern notion of the university will start coming into being. It'll take a while, but it'll start coming into being. And this is where the roots really lie in Western culture. So, moving forward, the first thing I want to do is I really want to impart the power and the understanding of what it would be like to walk into a medieval cathedral. And to do that, the first thing that we need to do is we need to go back and contemplate for a few minutes what it was like to be a medieval peasant. And to be a medieval peasant was a pretty dim life, short expected life expectancy, lots of hard and dirty manual labor, a lot of risk associated with it, very, very little control to no control over your outcome or your destiny, and no social mobility whatsoever. The concept of a middle class, or the birth of the middle class, hadn't really come about yet. And that wouldn't be until the Renaissance and post Renaissance that would really get kicking this middle class concept that most of us now reside in, at least in the United States. And then it's going to be truncated by a very small portion of the population that would be the ruling class or the religious class. And so, if this were your fate, you would spend your days walking around in what we would consider today to be mostly squalor. And then you would step foot inside the cathedral. And when you got there, you would be met by an extremely different experience and encounter. All of your senses would be engaged. You would smell the incense, you would hear music, and the acoustics would be incredible in these buildings. You would see hundreds of panes of stained glass lining the walls, illuminating with colors. Your clothes couldn't even you couldn't even afford color in your clothes. And here would be these wildly vibrant, colorful stories of the Bible. And in the front would be a bishop adorned in all his religious regalia. It would be the transformation into a truly spiritual experience. I mean, regardless of your own personal religious affiliations or ideas about religion, this would have been a mind blowing spiritual experience walking into one of these cathedrals and going there. And so I don't think we can underscore enough how important this was to shaping medieval politics, culture, art, all of those key components. And you have to remember, too, I mean, to add to the mystique of these spaces, when these illiterate peasants would walk in large numbers, they would be presented with a sermon in Latin, a language they didn't even understand and they couldn't read. And so it just added to the mystique and the mystery and the power and the awe that these places would harbor in the medieval mind, and to this day, to be quite honest. So as we move forward, we can't underestimate that impact. Now, what was the political significance? So getting back and now spreading out. Now the artistic, significance, let's talk about that just for a moment. This artistic significance is going to be huge. The cathedral and the construction of the cathedral is going to support over hundreds of years across Europe all sorts of different groups of people, which will have all sorts of skill sets, engineering skill sets and stonework, masonry skill set, uh, stained glass window artisans, rock carvers doing the gargoyles. And it's going to take a whole slew of these people to develop these things. So artistically, they're going to create an explosion of art throughout Europe. The other thing we're going to see is how the cathedral, because you have to ask your question, okay, wow, cathedral, pretty cool. Wow, it's a totally spiritual experience when you walk through the doors, but whoa, expensive. Holy cow, it's taking up massive amounts of money to pay for these things. And so you have to ask the question, medieval economics weren't that stable and were pretty rocky most of the time. So the question has to be asked, where did this money come from? And why was so much of that money allocated to the construction of these buildings? Well, it comes down to how it interacts with the political ruling class. And so when you walk into a cathedral, you would truly feel like, based on the impact of the cathedral on the external landscape and then the internal spiritual sense of the place, is that you were walking into the house of God. And the music that you would hear would be angels singing, and the color would be, representation of the glory of heaven. And so each of these cathedrals would have a medieval bishop, and that bishop would sit at the front and would be kind of illuminated in all of the grandeur of the church. And this person would directly interact with the ruling class, and specifically the king. And the king would be often referred to, even lower nobility would be referred to as lord. And if we look again at that notion of divine right, in divine right, we have God at the top. We have then below God, we have the king who is chosen by God to rule over the people. In the middle here, we kind of have the church. The church doesn't exactly decide the king, but sort of sometimes acts as an intermediary between God and the king. And obviously, very influential in medieval politics, the church, that is. And then below that, we have the nobles. And then below that, we have the vast majority of the people who are going to be the serfs or the peasants. And so, in order to keep this structure in place, you have to keep this notion of God having chose the king to be a very powerful relationship that's fully interconnected. And the cathedrals and the power of the church would help facilitate this relationship between the king having a godlike ability or being able to actively exercise the will of God upon his subjects. And so the cathedrals would act as a conduit for this concept of divine right. And that would fuel a lot of really interesting art and architecture, engineering, pretty massive developments. And so what I want to spend a little bit now time talking about now is Okay, how does this relate to the university and the birth of education as we know it? So during this time period, people started getting really interested in books again. And yeah, people have been interested in books before that, but there was a lot of traditions were orally passed. There wasn't a great deal of emphasis on understanding old complicated languages or philosophies or mathematics or even old religious texts. But now there's going to be a resurgence in these scriptoriums where people, monks, mostly religious clergy, would sit at these desks and they would sit there by the hour copying, hand copying these books. Early on, very often religious texts, even just the Bible, and hand copying it into Latin. But then over time, they would start to copy other books and they would start to establish these communities of people who would sit and copy a book. Now, for those of you who have ever had to copy copious amounts of notes out of a textbook, you know that while perhaps boring, the act of copying something very frequently instills a great deal of knowledge about the topic or subject. So let's imagine that you are a monk and you're sitting here and you are copying a book. Books were very expensive because of the amount of labor that would go into copying all these words down. So you'd sit there and you'd copy this book. And then after you got finished, you would know that there was a monk at another monastery or another cathedral, maybe 50 or 100 miles away. And you would take that book and you would send that book over to this person, and they would sit there and they would read the book as maybe they were even starting another copy of that book, hand copying it again. And then all of a sudden, you would say, when I send this book, I'm going to send this guy a letter. And we'll call this letter number 1. And this letter is going to talk about this book because, not many people read and nobody else has really read this book that I know. And I'd like to talk to somebody about it. And so he would send a letter here. And then this guy would send a letter back. And they would continue this process, possibly for a little while, communicating about this book that they were the only two people or one of a very small number of people who had ever read. And as they shared these ideas, this started a contemporary notion of scholasticism and how do we learn about something and how do we investigate something to know more about it. And so now it's not much different than what we do. A scholar will write a paper, and that paper will get sent out to the academic world where it gets reviewed, it gets criticized, it gets examined, and then other academics will take that article and include it, reference it, talk about it, maybe even answer some of the questions asked by the first academic. And this is basically this process right here is the birth of the structure, the philosophical structure for contemporary research papers. And this is how we ended up with the most important component of today's academic communication, the academic journal. And so today, when you go and you search, all those databases at the library website for a class, you are looking at, historically speaking, this process of people copying books and writing letters to each other to examine a knowledge set that they just happen to know quite a bit about, and the rest of the world does not. And so that's the birth of the university. And then, as you know from the other videos, almost all of the cathedrals would start to have some type of school university associated with them. Now, today we can see some of that tradition when we look at our fancy graduation regalia. So, as these religious clergy were sitting and hand copying these books, they were often in cold stone buildings that would require warm robes. And so they would wear these big heavy robes, and they'd often, because it was cold, they'd also wear a hat. And so today this has transferred into the contemporary tradition of wearing a cap and gown to graduation. It was also used as a way to distinguish in the halls of these cathedrals and these early universities the difference in education levels. And so today, when you go to a modern day graduation, if the person dressed up, if your instructor, professor, is wearing an outfit like this, it dictates that they have, with the three bands on the side, that they have a doctoral degree in their particular field and they wear this shawl. If you have a master's degree, it's this shawl with the standard mortar and pestle, or spacing on the name, standard hat. And then for here, you have a bachelor's. So as we look across, it's important to start to understand, how does this influence the greater world at that particular time period. We need to go back and talk about the fall of Rome just a little bit, because I want to talk about what we're going to refer to as brain drain. It's a contemporary term to talk about what happened during the fall of Rome. So Rome, as we know, we've kind of put that arbitrary date out there, falls at 500. It was really starting to crumble in the late 300s, but Rome fell for a variety of reasons that we've already talked about. One of the main reasons is because there was a lot of economic influence coming from the Visigoths, and not just economic, that they were starting to take over these regions, but also a militarized experience that was pushing down onto Rome. Economically speaking and culturally speaking, Rome was also having its own problems. But as Rome started to crumble, a lot of the upper class Romans were heading to Constantinople and they were setting up shop in Constantinople. And so, as we know, by 381 AD, the Bishop of Constantinople, however, shall have the pejorative of honor after the Bishop of Rome, because Constantinople is New Rome. And so the power of the church is sort of going to be split between Eastern and Western parts of the Christian empire at this time period. And as that starts to happen, we're going to see this brain drain. Constantinople is going to be the new hotspot. And I mean, even right now, as we're seeing in our world, people are moving away from urban centers and into rural America. We're also seeing, if we take a place like, if for those of you old enough to remember the invasion of Iraq and Afghanistan, there were a massive amount of people in Iraq, doctors, lawyers, the educated engineers who had the means, the economic means to get out of Iraq. That's what they did. And this is common when you have war or instability coming into your region. If you can leave, you do. And what ends up happening is the folks who left behind in most situations are poor and have less means to migrate due to the times. So as these people were leaving Rome, what were they doing? They were taking all of their books, their copies of Aristotle, of Plato, of the Greek plays, anything they could get their hands on, they took. Now, by the time we get to the 1300s, the Ottoman Empire is starting to put a lot of influence on Constantinople around the 1300s, even a little bit before that. But in the series of crusades and back and forth fighting, Constantinople is right here on the edge of the Ottoman Empire. And so as they start to get influenced, what are we going to see? Or economically kind of pushed? Eventually for roughly 1450, Constantinople will fall to the Ottoman Turks. And Constantinople will become a center for Islam again for a period of time. And as that happens, a lot of these kind of traditionally, when I say traditionally, I'm talking about hundreds of years traditionally, Roman citizens are going to start to head back towards Italy. Maybe not Rome exactly, but what are they going to take with them? Their ancient books. And what's this going to create? This is going to create or be a portion of the rebirth of knowledge. And this rebirth of knowledge is going to be what we're going to study next. And this will be referred to as the Renaissance. And so the Renaissance, we will say, let's just say very crudely, from 1300 to 1600 will be this period of the Renaissance that we're going to be studying for the next couple of weeks. And so this is going to be, the Renaissance will be fueled by the cathedral culture and university culture that's popping up. And it's also going to be influenced by a movement of old texts from east to west back into Italy. So that's your lecture for Unit 11. Let me know if you have any questions.